Hey, tailgaters! Ross of the Pigskin Tales podcast here. Feel that summer heat? It's not just the sun, it's the thrill of upcoming college football season, stoking the coals. So get ready for the season, dive into the history books with Homefield, the premium collegiate apparel brand from Indianapolis. Homefield crafts incredibly comfortable gear designed with iconic vintage nods over 150 colleges. A library of history right on your chest. Homefield is the Indiana Jones of collegiate apparel, uncovering hidden gems from school archives. Unique mascots, logos, and even unforgettable moments frozen in time. Visit homefieldapparel.com and shop the archives. Homefield Apparel, where comfort, nostalgia, and the spirit of college football history unite. Again, that's homefieldapparel.com.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com. By day, this week's guest is a math teacher. By night, he transforms into a number-wielding fantasy football superhero. Using the power of statistics, he helps you crush your opponents in your home league. And where do you go to get the upper hand, you might ask? Well, you head over to bestbellfantasy.com. Welcome to Fantasy Football Origin Stories, where each episode is a journey back in time to explore the unique experiences of some of the coolest and most influential people in the fantasy football industry. I'm your host, Arnie Chapman, also known as the Football History Dude. Now, I love fantasy football, and I want you to come along with me to explore the yesteryear of the armchair gridiron. So hop on board my DeLorean, and let's get this baby up to 88 miles per hour. This time we stoke the DeLorean, the date is September 8th, 2008. We're here at Lambeau Field, and the Packers are taking on the Minnesota Vikings in Aaron Rodgers' first start as a Green Bay Packer. Long time coming, depending on who you talk to. They would ultimately beat the Vikings 24-19. It only took a few years at the helm, then he would ultimately end up hoisting that Lombardi trophy. And he would end up having 4 MVP trophies, a mainstay for fantasy football drafts. And for this week's guest, this year marks the first time he will be without a designated, I'm using air quotes here, superstar quarterback at the helm. While yours truly finally has a summer where we're going into the season as the favored team of the North. But we'll get into all of that in the episode and how I found out he is not a Lions fan. He's in fact a Green Bay Packers fan. For now, let's look at the fantasy football history lesson for the week. We'll go back to that 2008 season when Rodgers was first at the helm. Actually, it turned out pretty good for the Green Bay Cheeseheads because he was the second best quarterback in fantasy that year, behind only Drew Brees. Of course, it's a little bit depending on the scoring system, just like everything is, so we'll use the Fantasy Football Reference PPR rankings. In 2008, the number 1 player was Andre 3000 Johnson. Then we have Larry Fitzgerald. So it all kind of makes sense, but at number 3 was a surprise to me. I didn't remember he was the top rated running back one year. D'Angelo Williams for the Panthers back then. Followed up by Matt Forte, of course, with a PPR league. He had a lot of catches. But again, I forgot D'Angelo Williams, number 1. And how about this? Steve Slayton, another Houston Texan, was at number 14. Either way, 15 years later, no Aaron Rodgers or Brett Favre at the helm. We're going to see what happens to this week's guest's favorite football team. But if you're looking for some advice on how to handle this transition into Jordan Love, well, maybe you should look no further than this week's guest, Bradley Stalder, where he is open for fantasy football counseling. You can find him over at bestbellfantasy.com. That's Bell as in B-E-L-L. We'll get more into that in this episode, but first, now is a good time for me to remind you to, you know what, if you like this show, you gotta mash that little subscribe or follow button in your podcast player of choice. That way you get the hottest, freshest off the press episodes, each and every week. And you know what, you also gotta share it with at least one friend as well, because we're coming close to the fantasy football season, and they're looking for more shows to listen to, even though this is one, like I said before, you can share it with them because we're not talking about daily, weekly, whatever it might be, kind of rankings and stuff. We're talking about the origin. But for now, let's get into this week's interview with Bradley Stalder. So one of the, well, just because I'm looking at your back of your head there, there's way too much green and yellow, not enough blue and silver for a dude that lives in Detroit. What is the deal here?
Yeah, so I moved to the Detroit area, what was it, about 8 years ago. It'll be 8 years this summer, and it's because I got married here. So my wife and I have been living here ever since, but I was born in Wisconsin, and Beloit, Wisconsin, just across the Illinois border. We actually lived in Illinois for the first 7 years of my life. My family did. But we were not Bears fans because my mom grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. My grandparents, Green Bay Packers fans. And my dad had moved out there to Illinois, but no one was a Bears fan. My dad grew up as a Cincinnati Bengals fan, Paul Brown Stadium, the whole bit. But that was because the Browns, kicked out Paul Brown. They fired him. And so my dad was not a big fan of that move. So he disavowed all of the Browns. So when we moved to, when we were in Illinois, we were just big Packers fans. And it was easy to root for the Packers back then. Brett Favre and the Green Bay Packers were very good. And they've been good for some time, some off years here and there. But when we moved to the Cleveland area, when I was 7, the Browns didn't exist at that time because they had moved from Cleveland to Baltimore. Art Modell had moved the team. So there were some pretty upset Browns fans, and my dad, of course, was like, well, we're already rooting for the Packers. There's no reason for us to be rooting for anyone else. And the Bengals were really bad at that time as well. So there wasn't a lot of love for anything other than the Packers. So yes, I have a lot of Packers things behind me, but the Robert Tonyan jersey I got 2 years ago. It was a gift from one of my friends in the industry, fantasy football industry, Billy Muzio, because at that time we had just started our Fantasy Football Fanalysts Podcast, and I had said, hey, there's this guy in camp getting a lot of buzz. His name's Robert Tonyan. He's a tight end, and I think he's going to be pretty good, and so we should consider drafting him on some of our teams. And Billy was like, oh, okay, I guess that's fine. So we did, and that was the season he ended up having double-digit touchdowns, and so Billy won a lot of money, and as a thank you, sent me a signed, framed jersey of Robert Tonyan, so you can see that in the background. But yes.
Yeah, of all Packers players of your time watching it, yeah, Big Bob Tonyan is not really the one that normally would go there. But okay, I'll let this go. I'll let it pass. I mean, I'm wearing one of my Lions shirts right now, so I mean, I was hoping finally I got.
Arnie, are you from the Detroit area?
Not from the Detroit area, a little further north, but I was hoping I'd be. Okay. When I saw that you said in your bio near Detroit, I'm like, oh, cool! I can talk to a guy about a Lions fan finally on here, and then that just went sideways in a real fast, hard turn when you opened up the video here.
Well, my father-in-law and my wife are Lions fans, and they're from around here. There's not been a lot to root for, to be fair, so maybe this is the Lions' year, Arnie. Maybe this is their year.
Yeah, well, it is. We'll just get that out of the way right away. It is going to be the Lions' year, and we're going to be reigning supreme for much longer than what the Packers even did. But this is a fantasy football show. Before we get there, though, so did I see that you got hit by a tornado, your bus, on the way home the other day?
Yeah, so I'm a teacher by day, and this is concluding year 10. So yesterday was the end of year 10 of me in the classroom and doing instructional coaching and lots of other things. This is I finished my 4th year at the school I've been at. And as part of our 8th grade field trip, we drove down from the Detroit area to Cedar Point. It was a great time, had a lot of fun. 8th graders had a good time. Didn't lose any kids either, so that's a plus. Yeah, but they had the time of their lives. I mean, I took some video of waiting in line. Some of my students had never been to Cedar Point, much less riding the Millennium Force. I don't know if you've ever ridden, Arnie, but that is a phenomenal ride. And it's my favorite one at the park. And I said, this is an amazing ride. We have to do it before we leave. And so we recorded their pre-anticipation, their excitement for it. And they're like, I don't know if I want to go on it, Mr. Stalder. And so afterwards, I recorded the video and I asked them, so what'd you think of the 310-foot drop? And they were like, that was amazing. Also, we're never going to do it again. And so we had a great time at Cedar Point. As we're driving back, I actually made a comment to one of the other chaperones and I said, hey, like, we've had a great time. Like, nothing has gone wrong. Nothing has gone wrong. It's been a great trip. 10 out of 10, would do it again. And we're driving from Sandusky. So Cedar Point is in Sandusky, Ohio. It's on the west side of the state, not quite Toledo. It's about 30, 40 minutes from Toledo. And we're driving past. We get up to Toledo. Once we get to Toledo, Ohio, a couple miles from the Michigan border, we start to notice traffic is slowing down. And our bus driver pulls off to the side about 2 miles from the border of Michigan on 75 North. And we look right ahead of us, and there is a tornado just coming right at us. So thankfully, there were some barriers in place and everything. Our bus only had one little crack in the front windshield, but other than that, nothing really to report. Thankfully, everyone was okay. But yeah, our bus got attacked by a tornado, caught in the middle of a storm, because there was a big thunderstorm in the Detroit area and it was really calm, in Toledo. So there was the two shifts of weather just coming at each other, and that's what caused the tornado. So it was pretty crazy. There were a couple teachers that teach at our school who teach down there, and one of their backyards got torn up pretty badly. So yeah, we're just thankful that everyone got out okay from the tornado. But yeah, it was pretty wild week here, Arnie.
Yeah, it's not something I expected when I was doing some research. Oh, hey, this guy got hit in a bus nonetheless by a tornado. And you mentioned Millennium Force, so you went 2 wild rides. My favorite part of the Millennium Force isn't the big drop. I don't remember which turn it is, but it's in between when you're looking at it and so from the front of it, there's a part where you kind of go up real fast. It's where you get that little bit like you're floating in the air for a little bit and it comes back down. That's my favorite part in all of Cedar Point, all the rides.
Oh, for sure. I've been riding that since I was a senior in high school, and maybe that's dating myself. Maybe it tells you how young I am too. I don't know. But I mean, I would take the ladies on dates there. When I was in high school, we would have a good time. It was a lot of fun. But yeah, Millennium Force, 10 out of 10, would recommend. It's a great ride. I'm glad we're able to share that experience together, Arnie.
Yeah, I mean, it's not something that a lot of people I've talked to in my day job even know about, because they're over on the East Coast, or even if I talk to the South, like they don't know what Cedar Point is, and it's way for me to transition. I'm trying to transition. Okay, so here's transition to fantasy football. Your students, do you ever use fantasy football to teach math in class then?
Yeah, I've used my projections in class. So I haven't talked specifically fantasy football, but I have shown how projections can be an important part of, the game that we play. So I've pulled up, for instance, I think it was last year when I was able to integrate it into the curriculum pretty well, using rates and rates of change to be able to gauge, 17 game totals based on, let's say, completion rate, and play rate. So it is using it that way, but I haven't we don't have fantasy football games. There are some schools. I don't think our school is very strict on those types of things, but I know some schools are pretty strict about what is perceived as gambling and what may be perceived as that type of gameplay. I also know that there are some. I did hear a story about a representative of one of the betting partners. She was a representative. I can't remember her name, but there was her story was floating around how she guested for one of her family members. She came and she was one of the substitutes for the day, and she gave a lesson and told them what sports betting was, and didn't get into specifics, just generalities. And I think she ended up getting laid off because the people got wind of it. So, you have to be very careful, I think, in this industry to share what you're going to share and the way in which it is. So I don't I tell the kids that I have a fantasy football podcast, and I tell the kids that I play, and like I do all of that, but I don't, go into it during the lesson itself, because I'm just cautious of how some people still in the sports world like view fantasy football and sports gambling all as one thing, and there are nuanced differences to it for sure. But you just have to be careful, I think, especially when you're working with kids, that there are people who also hold other values than you, and I think that that's fair to respect those. When we're in this very new industry where sports betting isn't legal in some places, and fantasy football games are not allowed in some states. So I think that there is a line that we have to be very careful of. But I just use my fantasy football projections as this is NFL data. These are NFL stats. And if we were to assign points to this, maybe, for these settings, this could work. But I think that's as far as I'm willing to go with students in a classroom.
No, that makes sense. I mean, because like you said, all the other repercussions, but then also like the statistics and the analysis and everything. You talked about Brett Favre. Let's just get this out of the way. Number 4 Packers and all that. What a knucklehead. But anyway, no, I liked him growing up too. So, what was your first memory of fantasy football, though? I mean, we talked a little bit about the Packers. What about fantasy football specifically?
Yeah, I did a couple drafts when I was in high school. There wasn't a lot of chatter in like 2007, 2008 when I started doing some fantasy football drafts. No idea what I'm doing at the time. I'm a 16, 17-year-old kid. But, that there are good players and you recognize the players and you want to draft. And it's a casual kid's game at that point. I grew up playing with, I got baseball cards just on my shelf. Like, just to the right of me off screen, I've got baseball cards and football cards and basketball cards. I would collect those. And I even have a couple unopened sleeves of Topps cards, on my shelf here. But I grew up like just calculating those as a kid and saying, I want to be a GM of these players. If I was a GM, I would like try to optimize the players and get the best stats that I could for a particular team. And then that translated into like middle school and early high school, like simulating games through high heat baseball, through NBA Live, through Madden. And those were a lot of fun. Like seeing that simulated, and I was like, I like playing this game. And so when it came to college, I wasn't part of any league until college that was of any meaning to me. And then a bunch of my buddies who I was in a household with, I went to Franciscan University in Steubenville, Ohio for undergrad. And a couple of guys in my household said, hey, let's get a fantasy football league together. And I said, sure, I'll play that. And so we've been playing together since 2011. I think it was 2011. So it's been a bit, and it's always fun every year. A bunch of them live in the Dallas, Texas area, so they'll get together, and sometimes I'll FaceTime in, sometimes I'll stream in too, and we'll draft live together. But that's been like the first. I remember the first player I drafted though when I was in high school, and it was Cadillac Williams in the first round. So
was that back when he blew his knee out and everything, or was it when he had a decent season?
I think he was a first round pick, so I think that was going into the good season. That's back
right. Yeah,
back
I don't remember specifically either. Yeah.
I was not focused. I didn't think, here in 2023, hey, I'd have to remember, Cadillac Williams' career arc. But, here we are talking about the fact that Cadillac Williams was probably the first player that I drafted for fantasy football back many years ago. But I think there was a pivotal moment probably 5 or 6 years ago where I started viewing myself as not just like a player, but like I started having strategy about I wanted to improve my takes and improve like spending time like grinding the waiver wire for this one league. And so just increased dedication there. This was like 5 or 6 years ago. And then, yeah, it's just grown ever since.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned, hey, I don't remember if Cadillac Williams, but you're actually ahead of the game because I don't even remember who my first player I drafted was, I don't remember specifically when my first, I always talk about it on this show. Like for a guy that's talking about fantasy football origin stories, I really can't remember my full origin story either. It feels like football's always been a part of it, you know, growing up watching Barry Sanders and everything. What about, so if you had to give me maybe a Mount Rushmore of experiences of fantasy football over the past, you know, you can give me a couple more if you want, but like your favorite moments of the past X amount of years that you've been playing.
Oh, there was a week 16 game, because that's when we were having the championship for my home league. The week 16 game, it was 2018. Golden Tate was playing for the Lions, and he caught like a 43-yard touchdown. And I was in the championship, and that's what sent me over. And Golden Tate was not a touchdown scorer. He was like a PPR guy. And I just threw him into the lineup, and a lot of my other guys busted in that week 16 matchup. But same thing with the other guy. So the other guy I was facing it was really low scoring relative to what we had been putting up the entire season. So that was wild. That it was like a 40-yard touchdown, and anytime that there was 40-yard plays or more, we would get bonuses in our league, in our home league. And so that little bit was what was able to edge me over my opponent in the championship.
Was that when they played the Vikings and he did that flip at the very end and then he got knocked in? Is that one, or is that a different?
It might have been because it was a big game for the Lions, I think. Well, interdivisional, that would make sense. So, but I was just so nervous because it reminded me of the same like storyline of the Cavaliers Warriors from 2016, where like, you know, get to game 7 and it's been a high scoring affair up until we get to game 7. Then it's like 93-89. You know, it's a grind it out, like defensive struggle. Nobody's making shots. And that's how I felt it was in that championship game. So I'd say that was up there. And then the other one was I was projected to lose by, I think, 40 or more points 1 week. And that was the week that Todd Gurley went off for like 55 points. And so I ended up winning that week. Like just watching the projected difference between your guy and the other guy on the ESPN app as I'm like driving around is like Christmas time. And I'm expected to just get walloped in this matchup. And Gurley like puts me on his back and said, "No, Bradley, like you're all set. I got you." And so Todd Gurley will forever be my favorite fantasy football player, just for what he could do in that Rams offense. It was so fun watching him play, and it's really sad that, you know, he wasn't able to finish his career, you know, probably the way he wanted.
Yeah, that was a bummer. I mean, unfortunately, that seems like the way of the path of most running backs. Even this year, we'll talk Zeke, who knows where he goes, and with Dalvin Cook being released. I don't remember specifically being able to get Gurley on my roster during that couple 2 or 3 year magical run. I know I had him in my only tournament, my kind of big money tournament that I won, which really wasn't that much. I had that one. It was Gurley, Le'Veon Bell, and I think even that was a year Kamara. So I had him in my flex, which it was just one of those deals where it kind of worked out. What about, so I didn't do this to you yet. So every week we got to show this DeLorean. So you get to hop in the DeLorean. You're going back in time. Let's get into your, as an analyst perspective, go back to the moment where you're like, hey, you know what? I like this fantasy football thing. Let me kind of start talking about it, writing about it, whatever it is, up until, you know, bestball, I keep calling it BestBell fantasy and all that other stuff, up until talking on the Fantasy Football Origin show.
For sure. I can tell you it happened during the pandemic, 2020. I'm sitting in the hospital room with my wife next to me in the hospital bed, and she had just given birth to our third child, Eleanor, and I'm sitting there. It is peaceful. We have nothing. It's just me and my daughter and my wife in the hospital room, and the pandemic is like, this is April. So we've been in the pandemic for a month at this point. And I'd been playing and I'd been crushing it at school. Like I'd done really well teaching. Like that year in particular, I'd done really well. And I felt like, you know what, I'm just going to continue to do really well in school. But I also am playing this game, Dynasty and Dynasty Fantasy Football, and I'm in my home league. I've really enjoyed that. And I said, you know what? Why don't I just find out what this whole content business is? Because I've done really well in my home leagues, and I'm doing pretty well. I've won some leagues in the Dynasty realm as well. And so maybe I can, contribute to this. And so I remember creating the Twitter account at FF Stalder, and then following like a massive amount of people, some that I knew, in the industry. Like I had been listening to, I've been listening to obviously ESPN's Matthew Berry, because, he is the godfather of fantasy football, and Field Yates as well, and Stefania. And then also listening to the Fantasy Footballers, which I felt was like the next step. Like that was the next move, was to listen to those guys. And I was really inspired by that trio. And then I started moving into listening to other podcasts, more niche podcasts that, up until that point, I said, if these guys are recording out of their garage, if these guys are recording out of their, whatever, wherever they're getting their video content or making whatever, like maybe this is something that I can offer my opinions on as well and try to help people just become better players. Because I'm doing well with this, I'm doing something right, and maybe I can be a better player myself. Iron sharpens iron. I'm a big believer that we all have things to offer in this industry, and there's space for each of us to be able to continue to improve as players. So I created that account, and then I decided, I've created this account. I've listened to a little bit already. I know Mike Clay had put out his projections each year, and I said, you know what? I'm a math guy. I have a math degree. Like how hard can projections be? Well, they're a little tedious, let me tell you, because I've done them each of the last 3 years, and I'm working on this being year 4. But that was the first move, was to create projections so that I could then form mathematical opinions about players, because I didn't have the data sheets or anything like that to be able to say, I've been hurt by this player, or I know this player archetype. I wasn't influenced by that level of bias, and maybe that's, a good thing. Maybe it's a bad thing at that point, but, I created the projections, and then in one of my dynasty leagues, I put it out. I said, hey, like, these are my projections for each of the 32 teams. What do y'all think? And one guy in my league privately messages me, and he says, hey, I'd like to discuss these projections with you. I'm like, sure. And so we went through some of the projections, and he said, you know what? Hey, can you share that like template with me? And I said, sure, I'll share it with you. So then he was like, all right, hey, these are my projections. Let's discuss these. And so we started talking more and more, and finally I said, you know what? Hey, why don't we share these with people? And he asked, how are we going to share them? And I said, well, why don't we start a podcast? And so that was the start of the Fantasy Football Fanalysts Podcast with Billy Muzio. So it was Bradley and Billy for 2 years. The first year, so from 2020 to 2021, we were independent. We were just us. And then from 2021 to 2022, we were brought under the helm of FantasyData. So those who are unfamiliar with FantasyData, one of the leaders in, you guessed it, FantasyData. And so thanks to Mike Patch, we were brought in, and a lot of gratitude. I want to share a lot of gratitude about Mike Patch. Mike has brought a lot of great people into the industry. He's been a great headhunter in that sense. I think Eric Moody and Andrew Erickson are two people as well who are products of Mike's work, gridiron experts. So Mike brought us on, and then about a year ago, Billy and I went our separate ways. He went to full-time fantasy for a year, and then I decided, you know what, this is an opportunity for me to try some things on my own as well, to like do some independent work. And so BestBell Fantasy was a product of us going our ways. And Right now, Billy is the director of operations for Player Profiler, and I am working with Player Profiler. We left, we separated amicably. Like Billy's one of the sharpest in the industry, but that was a tough move as well for me to like figure out where am I going to go in my fantasy football content journey from this point. So that's a little bit about where it started content wise about 3 years ago, and look at us now. in the middle of June in 2023 talking about fantasy football origin stories.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, BestBell. Why the name BestBell though?
Yeah, so I'd really gotten into best ball drafting, but one of the things that people struggle with, and I found this is a difficult thing as well to do, is player takes and player ranges of outcomes. The dirty word in fantasy football is upside, right? When someone says, "Oh, this player has upside," they don't really have upside. Like, there's only some players that have upside, even in the best of scenarios. And so Best Bell Fantasy is actually focused on the best bell curves of players, because while a player is not just one number or their points per game, they have a range of outcomes that could happen in a particular setting and a particular game, and maybe they fall on the wrong side of variance. But when we compare players over the course of time and particular profiles over the course of time, we can see that yes, the one player is in fact better than the other, not just in a points per game scenario, but even in the best of scenarios. You're not going to get a 40-point outing from them. You're not going to get a 30-point outing from them. And so what I've done is I'm very, very close. I have a draft ready of the Best Bell Upside Guide that hopefully will be coming out very soon. And it is going to focus on player ranges of outcomes, scoring distributions. It's going to look at a player's profile of like, okay, they've done really well in the past. We have a lot of data of them hitting upside, but maybe their age gauge is in the red. Like they've been a good player, but they're probably on the wrong side of the age cliff. And so each of the players who are getting drafted most commonly in fantasy drafts this year is going to get an upside guide profile. And I think it's going to be really helpful for fantasy football players to change the lens through which they look at these players and not just say, okay, this is a points per game, but this is their ranges of outcomes. This is their 84th percentile outcome. Like when this player hits the nuts, when this player goes off relative to their previous performances, what does that look like? Or what can we expect? And it's very eye-opening to realize that maybe we need to be grouping players in different tiers based on their historical scores. Maybe they had a bad year last year and that historical score is going to indicate that they're due for a bounce back. Like there are a couple of players like Russell Wilson, Justin Herbert, and Deshaun Watson who are all being, I think, underdrafted this year, especially for best ball tournaments, given their historical upside relative to what they just did last year. So I mean, those are just some examples of players that the Best Ball Upside Guy is going to indicate to you that in a game where only the best scores matter, you want to be picking players who can access the best scores. And maybe that's going to change people's takes. And like, of course, in best ball tournaments, you have to keep in mind roster construction. You have to keep in mind bye weeks. You have to keep in mind correlation and stacking and all of those things, which are important. But to improve our player takes for best ball tournaments, I think that's one thing we need to keep in mind is, can this player access upside? And so Best Bell was kind of the origin of that thought.
Okay, now it makes more sense now. And so if a listener of the show wants to, oh, hey, this guy's piqued my interest, and I definitely want to try it out, like where do you recommend that they go? How do they find your work?
Yeah, so I tweet out a lot, BestBell, at FF Stalder. As I said, the BestBell Upside Guide will be coming out shortly. I'm working on platforms to be able to get it published, so I will be tweeting out once that's available. I also have the website, bestbellfantasy.com. That's going to be where I will host my projections, so they are in progress right now, even though it's a live document. That's for free. And if there are specific consultation questions, I've drafted on FFPC. I've won leagues on there. What else? Best Ball Underdog. Like, I don't have Underdog in Michigan, but if you want to tag me in to help you with it, I can do that as well. I've done Drafters and DraftKings, Dynasty as well. So I have consultation available for purchase on the website as well. And then I've also linked previous articles I've written for Top Prop Fantasy, for FantasyData, for Full-Time Fantasy. And then the Player Profiler, my first Player Profiler article dropped last week, and it was on the why 0RB is the right move during the Dynasty offseason, and it's the right move the further you are from the start of the season in Best Ball.
So again, that website, if someone wants to go check it out, what's the web address?
bestbellfantasy.com.
All right, so I'm going to head to bestbellfantasy.com, and then I'm going to ask Bradley to give me let's go with, because somebody that really jumped into the industry due to the nature of COVID, and you only been in for a little bit, but you've made some strong, quick waves. What kind of recommendation do you give to someone that's like, wow, I think I might want to follow that path as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say first, make a decision of how are you going to view fantasy? Are you going to view it as, I'm going to have an opinion on every player to start and then just whittle down for player takes? Am I going to take fantasy for, this is a general game we play, and then use player takes as like pieces to the puzzle? Like, how are we viewing the game that we're going to play? Because there are lots of games we can play. So I say first, pick your niche, or your niche, however you pronounce it, however you like to pronounce it. Pick your niche. Find the way in which you're going to be successful in that niche. Try it out for a little bit. And then say, you know what? I've gained success doing this strategy, this strategy, this strategy. And then share out those successes. Whether that is through player takes, whether that is through a different lens of looking at players, whether that is, I'm going to try a macro strategy. I'm not really going to look at the players I'm drafting, like strong. I'm not going to have strong player takes, but I am going to stack my teams. Let's try the stacking, in this particular niche, like in Best Ball, for instance. I'm going to focus on stacking. Maybe I'm going to focus on correlation. I'm going to share that out. And then I'm going to have different ways to test it. Now, there are ways in which many in the industry have gotten successful, like Matt Harmon's reception perception has been an invaluable tool for many people that informs their player takes, right? We're able to see whether wide receivers are successful and on what routes they're running. Like, that's just an example for Matt of how he's able to take a very important but small niche, and then he's able to expand it to, okay, it's applicable here for fantasy. It's applicable here for, DFS. It's applicable here. And then he has a platform now and some way in which he is now very reputable and respected in the industry. And so there are, like, pick your niche, pick your way in which you're wanting to go down a path. Maybe you're a high stakes player. Maybe you're someone who says, you know what, I'm going to put a lot of money up front, and I'm going to compete with other people who are putting a lot of money up front, and I'm going to use platforms that are doing it, and then offer analysis based on that very small niche of players who are putting a lot of money up front. But that may mean that, if you win even more in those particular leagues. So maybe this is what high stakes drafters are doing. There are a lot of different niches. So I would encourage, someone just getting into the industry to find their niche. Maybe it's dynasty. I know plenty of players who have gotten into the content side who have said, you know what, I'm really good at playing in these dynasty leagues. I've used these strategies, and these are ones that I found most successful. And these are players who fit well with that success. So I would say, yeah, find the niche and then document your successes and then share them out as well. And then interact with other people who are in this space that are also in your niche or who are adjacent to your niche. So maybe you're not a high stakes player, but maybe you do 1 or 2 high stakes drafts throughout the off season just to expand exposure as well. Maybe you're primarily a best ball player. Maybe you play some dynasty best ball with some players who are primarily dynasty players. That's a way for you to expand a little bit. So I'd say, start with a niche, build up some reputation in there, and then expand.
There you go. Best Bell Fantasy. To get some fantasy football advice from an educated math teacher, all you gotta do is head over to bestbellfantasy.com. I'll even let it slide that he's a dang Packers fan living in Michigan, but for good reason. So, again, we'll pass it up. Now, next week, we're going to hear from a former fullback and running back who spent time in the Arena Football League, as well as semi-pro football, now dibble-dabbling a little bit in the fantasy football space. Craig Schmucker. But for now, dude, I'm through if you're through. Thank you for listening to this episode of Fantasy Football Origin Stories. To make sure you're the first to get the next episode, please make sure to mash that little subscribe or follow button on your podcast player of choice, then head over to the website for the show notes and more fantasy football origin stories. That's at fantasyfootballoriginstories.com. And remember, dudes, where we're going, we don't need roads. Hey there, sports history fan. Hope you enjoyed another nostalgic episode here on the Sports History Network. By now, you've heard us rave about 2 books, The Golf Round I'll Never Forget and NBA 75, The Definitive History. Have you snagged your copies yet? If so, well, we applaud you for great taste. But if you haven't, well, listen up, because our generous partners over at Firefly Books are giving away a free copy of each book to one of our dedicated fans. To enter the giveaway for your chance at winning one of these awesome books, head over to sportshistorynetwork.com/giveaways. Again, that's sportshistorynetwork.com/giveaways. Good luck, and remember, you can come back daily to earn more entries.